Welcome, class. Today we're going to be talking about ADHD and auditory processing disorders. These disorders can cause the symptoms of language impairment. So that's why we're learning about them today. Let's start with our slideshow here. So our learning objectives for today are: list the signs and symptoms of ADHD, state the language problems seen in children with ADHD, state a definition of auditory processing disorder, describe symptoms parents might observe that suggest that their child may have an auditory processing disorder, and number 5, explain the emotional and social effects of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder and auditory processing disorder. So, first, let's talk about ADHD. It's pretty well known, and I bet you or maybe someone you know may even have this, because it happens a lot. I actually think your professor probably has a little bit of it too. So, let's see here. It's a syndrome, and the 3 basic areas that have to be impaired for ADHD are inattention, impulsivity, and hyperactivity. Those are the things that have to be a problem in order for you to be diagnosed with ADHD. So according to the DSM-5, and remember the DSM is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, it's mainly full of psychological disorders and things like that. The presence of the symptoms has to last for 6 months or longer. Sometimes people can get distracted or have inattention or have bursts of energy, which would cause hyperactivity with different things that happen within their health or things that they're going through. So that's why it has to be a longer time for a person to be diagnosed with ADHD. It can't be just like an episodic problem. Episodic is just like episodes of TV. It happens once a week, and then happens maybe another time next week, and then maybe it might not even happen at all for 4 or 5 months if you're waiting for the episode to start again, right? The season opener. So that's what episodic means. That means every now and then, but not all the time. So the length of the symptoms matters. Also, the presence of symptoms before 12 years of age. That is typically the time that people are identified. But I will say something else about that. Presence of symptoms in 2 or more settings. So it can't just be in school only, right? It has to be in school and another setting like home, or maybe at church, or while they're playing on their ball team, things like that. So it needs to be more than one setting for it to be, because if it's just at school, there could be a lot of reasons a child doesn't pay attention at school, right? Or are hyperactive at school. There could be, maybe they're struggling to learn and they've kind of given up, right? Or what if they're a really brilliant kid and they're bored to death at school? That can be another reason why children might have these types of symptoms pop up in one setting. Evidence that symptoms interfere or reduce the quality of social, academic, or occupational functioning. So with many of the disorders that we talk about, there has to be, in order for it to be a disability, we have to prove that it impacts their life, either socially, academically, or for their future occupational functioning. What I was going to say about before 12 years of age. Most of the research on ADHD has been about boys. Boys typically show up a whole lot more as having ADHD. But we're finding that girls have masking ability more than boys do, where they they have the same ADHD issues, but they learn to mask it. And what I've learned from that is that ends up causing a lot of these girls to be depressed or anxious about life. Sorry about that, I had to sneeze. But that's the reason why a lot of girls may not be diagnosed before the age of 12. This also happens in autism, and we're going to talk about that, I think, during our next lesson. So, ASHA has a statement and what they think ADHD and auditory processing disorders have on people. They have inattention, difficulty concentrating, have unrelated thoughts, meaning they can't stay on the topic when they're talking about things, have trouble focusing and sustaining attention, appears not to be listening. Performance does depend on the task. I hear lots of people say, well, he can stay focused on Fortnite for hours. Why can't he stay focused at school? Well, that's because it's a preferred task. Plus, Fortnite and a lot of those things that kids with ADHD really enjoy tend to be kind of action-packed, right? So it holds your attention. Unfortunately, your teachers in the elementary school, middle school, and high school can't run around like action heroes fighting crime and changing weapons and changing their outfits and doing those weird dance moves like they do on Fortnite. So that can't compare, really, right? It's really hard for it to compare, especially if the child is struggling, or if they're bored. They're going to have trouble with some tasks, but not others. They may have better attention with enjoyed activities. That's the same concept as the bullet point before that. Has difficulty planning, organizing, and completing tasks on time. So, I think we're going to talk about the words executive functioning during this lesson. And that is one of the issues that executive functioning does for us in our brains. Our brains help us plan, organize, and complete tasks on time. But when you have ADHD, there's a breakdown there. Has problems learning new things. Demonstrates poor self-regulation of behavior. That is, it's difficult. They have difficult monitoring and modifying their own behavior to fit the situation or setting. As we all know, we can kind of behave differently when it comes to different settings. We kind of have some rules on how we ought to behave at school. And then they have a separate set of rules at home. They can get away with this. Sometimes home is more strict than school, or vice versa. Also, they just don't understand and have trouble reasoning their way through how I need to act in this situation sometimes. So let's talk about hyperactivity. They seem unable to sit still and they got the wiggles. Some examples are squirming in their seats, roaming around the room, tapping pencils, wiggling feet, and touching people and things. They appear restless and fidgety. May bounce from one activity to the next and often tries to do more than one thing at a time. And typically people with ADHD aren't really good at multitasking, even though they do bounce from one thing to another. Impulsivity. Difficulty thinking before acting. Hitting a classmate when they're upset or frustrated with them. Problems waiting his or her turn, such as when playing a game. And we've seen some kids when they're playing a game and it's not their turn, but they want to go all Real Housewives on their set of friends and flip the board. You know what I mean? Because they don't understand and don't have the patience for waiting till it's their turn, especially if they know exactly what they want to do and they might win the game. There are some associated disorders with ADHD. Auditory processing disorders sometimes looks like ADHD and vice versa. Learning disabilities often come with ADHD as well. Behavioral disorders like oppositional defiant disorders, there can be some OCD that comes with ADHD. Anxiety and depression. Imagine if you felt kind of out of control over your brain and your body. That would give me some anxiety, and especially if you're always getting in trouble. I was that kid in school. I had to sit next to my third grade teacher's desk all year long, and I knew it wasn't because I was her A-plus student, if you know what I mean. So I realized that every time I did anything, I was taking a risk about getting in trouble, and that can cause lots of anxiety when you can't trust yourself to know what to do in different situations. Then there's also depression. When you go through ADHD for years after years and you struggle and struggle and struggle and don't get a lot of wins, that can be very depressing. So those are some disorders that can go along with the ADHD. Let's talk about the prevalence. Worldwide, about 5% of children have ADHD. According to parent reports, around 9% of 4 to 17-year-olds have it, and 6% of those take medications for it. The U.S. physician's diagnosis is slightly lower, but not much, at 8.5%. The average age of a physician's diagnosis is 7, and the average age of ADHD diagnosed by a psychiatrist or psychologist is 6, because they're usually kind of more tuned into the cognitive part of the ADHD. This is the bad news. Incarcerated or in detention individuals estimate a prevalence of around 40% with ADHD. 5% higher than the general population. Your symptoms can change with age, but let's go back a slide or two. Let's talk about impulsivity. Can you understand why people are more likely to have almost half the prisoners we have ADHD? Think about it. They have difficulty thinking before they act. They don't want to wait their turn. They're restless and fidgety. They have where's the third one? Did I not do a slide on inattention? This is inattention, I guess. Sorry about that, folks. But think about it. They don't pay attention. They might not pay attention to what the laws are or the signs on the road or whatever. They don't know how to regulate emotions. And that can cause criminal behavior if it's not treated properly and they're not given the right kind of tools and strategies to get through life with ADHD. I thought that was interesting. Speech and language delays and disorders do come about with ADHD. And here's the phrase I was telling you about, executive dysfunction. It's a disruption of the executive functions that regulate, control, and manage your cognitive processes. And it impacts behaviors and emotions. So some of the things, if some of you are like, I'm a planner, I have everything spelled out, I am always got everything in my calendar, so I'm never late for anything. All of these things, you probably have really, really great executive functioning skills. I have excellent executive dysfunction skills, but I have learned through life all of the things that I need to do to be productive with my problems with inattention and impulsivity and hyperactivity, right? I don't have a diagnosis by a doctor because I was born during the time where we weren't handing out ADHD diagnoses for even boys who were just bouncing off the walls, right? And they certainly weren't diagnosing a lot of girls. This kind of, the ADHD thing kind of happened more in the 1990s and the early 2000s to present time. So that's when people started really thinking about it, looking at it, and helping those kids who have it and how it impacts all the other areas of learning and getting through daily tasks in life. So a lot of research has been put into it later in life. I have a friend who, her name is Elizabeth. She went to Vanderbilt University. She's much smarter than I am. She was a Marine at Vanderbilt in their ROTC Corps. And she wasn't diagnosed with ADHD until she was 49 years old. And actually, it's her story that it had me thinking about whether or not I had it. Because I was like, you're supposed to be diagnosed with this by the time you're 12. But she was an excellent student and very smart. And I was smart. I was very smart in school. I wasn't always an excellent student. But she was very driven, intrinsically driven to do things in life. And I didn't have that drive that she had back when we were kids. So she started listing all of the things that happen in girls and women, and mine manifested in depression and anxiety. So I think that had I been a little better understood, who knows what I could have done. My assistant that worked with me for a very long time, my SLPA, her name was Raisa. It's still Raisa. She was in graduate school while she was my SLPA, and she was diagnosed with ADHD, and she came home and came to work after that diagnosis and after taking her medication for about a week. And she goes, if I have it, you have it times 5, because she's worked with me for so long and knows how busy my mind is. And she said, you should get on medication. And I was like, well, and I talked to my doctor about it, but we decided that I'm really functional the way I am. And we probably don't need to do that, because I found all of these strategies and techniques to help me with any symptoms that I might have for ADHD. Went the wrong way. Okay. There are some comorbidities. And remember, comorbidities are 2 disorders that happen at the same time. And when we study different disorders, we can kind of see these are common comorbid disorders with ADHD, or these are common comorbid disorders with language disorders. You see what I'm saying? So the first one is the other thing we're going to talk about in this lesson, auditory processing disorders. Autism spectrum disorders. Many of our autistic friends have ADHD. Traumatic brain injury. Motor development problems. Sleep problems, learning difficulties, anxiety disorders, behavioral or opposition defiant disorder, and, important to us, speech and language delays or impairments. So, how do we assess it? Well, we look at behavioral problems at home, and that's usually what gets people referred, is behavior. That's why all those little boys get referred for ADHD and the little girls don't always, because we are taught to control ourselves, even if it's mostly impossible to do so. We try really hard to meet those societal norms that we're supposed to meet, where they're like, boys will be boys, you know? So even from home, there's pressure on little girls to not get in trouble at school, to tote the line, and they might get in trouble at home if they act up. But boys, their moms and dads are like, oh, he's all boy. Well, he might be, and boys should be active, but so should girls, by the way. But that doesn't always mean they have ADHD, but it could mean that. So a lot of times the big red flag are chronic behavioral problems at school or at home, learning disabilities. And that's why people get referred and go to that first evaluation. Hear this, it's on your test. So, woo, woo, woo. SLPs and SLPAs, we cannot diagnose ADHD. We are not allowed to diagnose ADHD. Okay? We can't do it. It's not ethical. We can't even suggest it to people. Okay? So, if you're ever asked by a parent, do you think that my child might have ADHD? You would probably need to say, I'm not sure, because we don't diagnose that, but you can talk to your pediatrician or your family doctor, and they can refer you to people who can help you with that if you have concerns. Or you can talk to the classroom teacher or the guidance counselor at school. They're not diagnosing it either, but they can help that family get the resources that they need. So, no diagnosis from us. Assessments and diagnoses are made by physicians. Sometimes it's the pediatrician, it could be a psychiatrist or a neurologist or a psychologist or a neuropsychologist. So, what usually happens is the parent fills out a behavioral rating scale. And if it's done well, teachers and most of the people that work with that child also need to be filling out those behavioral skills. Because remember, it needs to be in more than one setting over time, right? So it needs to be done by someone who's had at least 6 months with the child. And usually the speech pathologist has that much time with the child. Classroom teachers, if it's just September, they haven't seen it. So they might actually collaborate with last year's teacher in order to answer some of those rating skills. And then the doctors typically just look at the rating scales, and if they do poorly enough, some of them just give them the diagnosis then. We can help be a resource for the assessments, okay? We don't diagnose. We are really good observers, SLPs. So we observe interactions with peers, with authority figures. We look at how they do when they have to be quiet for classroom tasks, or like how do they act during TCAPs? We want to observe those conversations and interactions that they have with their parents or other family members. We want to interview their parents. During that regular interview that we do, we're going to find out what some of their concerns are. And a lot of times, their behavior even comes up in our, parent interview. So we can formally and informally evaluate speech and language. And that can give the person diagnosing a good bit of information about how it might be impacting them with their language, with their communication. And that's one of those factors where, how is it impacting them? All right. So we want to find out if they can explain or retell a story and make sure they stay in sequence. We can assess the social communication skills or their pragmatic language. We can discuss stories and the points of view from various characters and see if they're able to follow that. And we can assess the ability to plan, organize, and attend to details, which touch that executive functioning. And I think that executive functioning is also on your test, so be sure and look into that before you take your test. Treatment. So, as a lot of things, it's a team approach because ADHD really impacts many areas of the child's life. It's not something they can turn on or off. It can impact them academically, but it also can impact them socially. It can make them, if they're a gifted athlete, it can make them even hard to coach, so that even though they have these athletic gifts, if they aren't coachable, then they might not be as good as they could be with sports even. We want to help the family and child understand the disorder itself and the treatment of the disorder. We want to work on behavioral management, and we can do that in many ways, and sometimes SLPs have really good ideas about that. If the school doesn't have like a behavioral specialist, we can look at visual tools that we can use to help a child to meet behavioral goals. We can suggest classroom accommodations to help ensure good behavior in the class. And then one of the last things that we look at, hopefully, is medication. And typically that's stimulant medication, because I think everyone knows by this time that for some reason, when you give stimulants to typical people, it kind of gets them going. I'm drinking caffeine right now, and it's in the evening time because I need to go. However, it really doesn't get me going. I just like how it tastes and like that it's fizzy. But For people with ADHD, stimulants tend to calm them. And I think that's why I have probably a small addiction to Coke Zero and my Zevia drink. So, because they do kind of calm me down. And it's just odd how that works with some people and how it doesn't work with others. And we can have appropriate speech language goals to kind of aid. And we are aiding the family with these goals. We are helping with language and study skills with these goals. And we're going to help support the teacher with any ideas that we might have, where we can kind of observe a situation and analyze it and then give good feedback on things to try. Because a lot of things with kids who have disorders like this is trial and error. Even with the medication, right? If you've had children or a family member or you yourself have ADHD, you may have had to try. Might have had to try several different medications to find what works or the dosage needed to make things work. And it can take a long time from what I'm told. All right, let's talk about auditory processing disorders. Like I said, they can look a lot like ADHD. And when we talk about the acronym we use is APD or CAPD for central auditory processing disorders. Okay, I used to just call it CAPD because that's what we called it back in the Stone Ages. So anyway, this is the ASHA definition for auditory processing: the perceptual processing of auditory information in the central nervous system and the neurobiological activity that underlies that processing and gives rise to electrophysiologic auditory potential. Easy, right? That definition has more 50-cent words in it than I've seen in a long time. So how do we really want to think about this? Here's another definition that I tend to like too. The auditory processing disorder is what we really need to understand. That's the difficulty using auditory information to communicate and learn without the presence of a hearing loss. So the auditory processing, all of those big words are all the things that have to happen in your nervous system and in your auditory system for you to understand what you hear. Right now, I hear a little wiener dog whining on the other side of my door. But since I'm recording right now, it's probably not a good idea for him to be in here because he can bark at things out the window. But I can hear him and I can process it, and I know that that's my dog's whine because I can pick it out in a crowd of dogs. So you cannot have a peripheral hearing loss, which means a hearing loss with all the structures of your ear, okay? But you still can't understand, communicate, and learn what you hear auditorily, all right? So I don't think that big fancy definition is on your test. If it is, then I'm so sorry. But I think the most important thing for you to understand is what the disorder is, that simpler definition on the second bullet point. So people with auditory processing disorders typically have difficulty with understanding speech, especially in adverse listening environments. So what's an adverse listening environment? Can you think of something? Well, it's when there's lots of background noise and a lot of things going on that compete with the speech that they're trying to hear. I know half the time if I'm at a concert, probably damaging my hearing, that when my friend who is this close to me talks to me, I can't understand a lot of what they're saying because there's too much noise competing with that one small voice, right? She has to, the last time I went to a concert, it was my friend Brenda, Rick Springfield and REO Speedwagon. That's how old I am. But she was trying to tell me something and she had to get in my ear and just say it in order for me to hear and vice versa. They often misunderstand messages, respond inconsistently or inappropriately to conversations or to questions. They frequently ask that information be repeated, and they have difficulty attending and avoiding distraction, which sounds a lot like ADHD, right? Delaying and responding to oral communication, which also sounds like inattention. So a lot of these things do kind of look like ADHD, but it's processing auditory information. And we are asked to process a lot of information auditorily at school, right? Teachers like to talk. I'm making you listen all over the place with these videos. I'm looking forward to the time when we can have class in person when you get into the program, and we're doing more in-person time together, because I feel like maybe I'm a better teacher in person, maybe. I hope I am. So they have difficulty following complex auditory directions. They don't have great musical or singing skills because they're not processing even what they're doing. Associated with reading, spelling, and learning problems, they can have unusual reactions to sudden or loud sounds, difficulty remembering names, dates, times, and other information that they're told, difficulty identifying directions, a voice from another room. And, we have those bat skills, just like bats do, where we can localize, that's what that word is called, when we identify the direction of a voice. That's called localization. And that means if you have your eyes covered and I hear a sound, I know which way to turn because I can hear the direction from which that sound is coming from. So that's called localization. They might also have difficulty remembering items that they were told to take to school. Excuse me. Here's some more. They have difficulty remembering lists of items to buy at the store. They have to write it down. I think that at some point now, I feel like I'm probably having auditory processing disorder. I'm like, I have to do that. I have to write this down now. But my grandmother was very wise, and she said, you don't have time to remember everything, and not everything is that important when you can write it down. So she wasn't a big believer in me having an auditory processing disorder. Okay, they might have difficulty. We already said that. Easily distracted, confused during conversations. They might have poor relationships with family members and peers and might have few friends. So that's one of those social emotional aspects of auditory processing disorder. It's not a good thing when friends don't listen to each other and are able to respond appropriately. You know what I mean? Because friendship really does rely on back and forth communication. Wouldn't you agree? So, let's look at ADHD and all these different disorders. These are those comorbidities. They all can be together at one time and interact. A lot of people don't have all of these at the same time. That would be a very, very, very low functioning person probably. But they all interact. If you have trouble processing things auditorily, you're going to have inattention that looks like ADHD. Or your ADHD may compound it, right? Language disorders happen when you're not comprehending the language that you're hearing. Or maybe you're not able to complete that communication loop and speak to respond. Learning disabilities, if your teacher's heavily into auditory, like especially school teachers in K through 12, talk a lot, then it's going to be more difficult for those students to learn the concepts that they need to learn. Anxiety and depression can come after that, and headaches and stomach aches often happen with students when they're having when they're having all 5 of these things happening, any of those can cause a kid to have headaches and stomach problems because of the anxiety and the depression. And that might be a way that they can get out of those situations if they're sick, or the body makes itself sick because it's having trouble handling all those things. All right, what are some speech and language problems with APD? Auditory figure ground problems. Oh my gosh, what's figure ground? Well, figure ground means hearing a message while you're hearing background noise. And a lot of times, the way it's tested is the background noise sounds like a fan, like white noise, right? So that they test how well a person can hear a tone or anything like a word when they're listening to background noise too, to kind of see where that threshold is, like how loud can the background noise be, and they're able to understand the prompt that they're given. Difficulty recognizing subtle differences between sounds and spoken words. Well, what can that cause? It can cause problems with reading if they're having trouble with those subtle differences between sounds. Also, articulation or speech disorders. Speech, reading, spelling, and writing problems, difficulty following conversations, answering questions, understanding jokes. That can be hard too to make friends if you don't understand like why that joke was funny, right? And you can't tell a joke if you don't ever hear a good joke. It's hard to make them up. Slow, delayed, and inappropriate responses to questions and other communications. You ever have a conversation with someone and you like their gerbil is still going around in their brain wheel? It's like, I know they're processing this. I'm just going to give them a minute. And that might be part of what the problem is with certain people with APD. They, again, have trouble following multi-part directions because they missed or misunderstood parts. And they might say, what? Can you say that again? Huh? Difficulty remembering information and difficulty processing rapid speech. So, here is a table from your textbook, Table 9.1, and it's behavior seen with auditory processing disorders versus ADHD. So let's take a look at this. APD has difficulty hearing and background noise. ADHD, inattentive. Difficulty following oral directions. ADHD, distracted. Poor listening skills. Well, they might be hyperactive. Academic difficulties. They have fidgety or restless behaviors. Poor auditory association skills. Hasty or impulsive behaviors. Distracted, interruptions or intrudes, and they're basically just seen as inattentive. So you can see how a lot of them look the same. Those aren't all perfect examples of being similar, but think about it. Both of these people who have both of these disorders could look very similar in many ways. SLPs are often the first to recognize an auditory processing disorder. SLPs can't diagnose an auditory processing disorder. Only audiologists can diagnose this, okay? Bells, bells, bells. Audiologists diagnose APDs, not SLPs. We can diagnose speech disorders, language disorders, and in the schools we can do sign off on hearing disorders only if we have all the supporting information from an audiologist. So really, we're just kind of like the messenger for the hearing disorders in schools. We can screen for APD. And I'm not going to have any of these tests on, test on the test. So there's tests for auditory processing disorders. The one I've given the most is the TAPS 3, and I think there's a TAPS 4 now. Yeah, I think. And then we can also do a comprehensive language evaluation just to see how language might be impaired by some of the auditory processing problems. So the treatment for auditory processing is tailored to the individual. Usually we do talk about it in a multidisciplinary team, which would be maybe the audiologist, maybe the child's doctor can give input, the speech pathologist can get input on how language is impacted and speech is impacted, the classroom teacher, the parent, of course, and of course we want to talk about this with the child. All right. So we want to work on a bottom-up and top-down treatment approaches. And let me tell you about that. So the bottom-up treatment approach is where you do auditory training. You start at the very bottom and basic skill. And you also work on the child's environment in the classroom. And that's where SLPs are really good at making accommodations or taking the audiologist accommodations to the team. They might need what's called an FM device. And you can see that down under 3-component approaches. So environmental modifications is part of bottom up. Personal FM system is part of bottom up. And how that would be to have an environmental modification is maybe seat the child closest to the teacher while they're teaching so that they can best take in a lot of visual information, also focus more auditorily on what the teacher is saying. But really a great strategy is a personal FM system. And those systems are, they usually work with a hearing aid or like a AirPod type situation or a cochlear implant. They work with all those things. But basically the teacher wears a necklace or that you can put this little, it looks like a tiny little speaker, but it's actually a microphone that goes in every direction. And the child can actually pick the direction. If they're working in a small group with other kids, he can put a microphone toward where each kid is talking by pushing a button, and it will receive information from that direction. Then it wirelessly connects to whatever device is in the child's ear. And it only amplifies the speech. It gets rid of all those different background noises for the figure ground. All right. So it's a really cool system. A lot of them are compatible with hearing aids, and because we use this for people with hearing impairments as well, not just auditory processing, but they can wear, if they don't have a hearing aid, they can wear something in the ear that works kind of like a hearing aid. And what it does is it just pushes out all that background noise so the child can hear directly what they need to hear without the distractions of all the other sounds. The top-down treatment approaches, and I'm going to read about this because this is an audiology thing that I wasn't quite sure about, and I certainly didn't want you to get the wrong idea because I've done mostly bottom-up. Top-down address higher-level processing and the ability to understand and attach meaning to the auditory message. So basically, you're teaching them in real time to process higher level information. So I guess it's saying the logical thing that speech pathologists typically do is go from easiest to hardest. Well, it kind of makes sense. When you're having trouble processing things auditorily, we don't want to completely forget about the higher functioning things, do we? We want to give them that foundation, but we also want to put a roof on top and make sure that they have all these high skills too, and don't miss out on those completely. So that does make sense. I just had to look it up to make sure I told you the right thing. All right. So we want to do direct remediation and auditory training with anyone diagnosed with APD. We want to target intensity, fluency, and duration discrimination. So intensity is how loud it is. Frequency is the level of hertz that the sound is, and duration is how long it lasts. Phoneme discrimination and phoneme to grapheme skills are often told. And when we work on it, we cover our mouths either with a piece of paper like this and go, what's that sound? And they can point, they might have a field of letters there and they need to point to the M sound or the M letter, or they can say M. We don't want them to get physical, visual clues when they're working on processing auditorily, right? So it sounds weird, but sometimes we cover our mouths like this or use a piece of paper so that they can't get clues by lip reading. Okay, does that make sense? I hope it does. Temporal gap discrimination, that's when you give them a stimuli sound and then you have them wait and then they have to tell you how they've discriminated that sound from another. Temporal ordering and sequencing, same thing. Temporal means putting time in between the stimuli and the response. Pattern recognition. Those are just things that we do. Visual pattern recognition could be circle, circle, triangle, circle, circle, triangle, right? Well, we can do the same thing with sounds, and we want to see if they can recognize those patterns with sounds. We want to teach them and work on localization and lateralization, which is what we talked about, how you know where sounds are coming from, by giving them stimuli coming from different places, closing their eyes and turning to the sound or pointing to the sound. Recognition of auditory information presented within a background of noise or competition. Noise is a competition to speech in many situations. We are rarely in a situation where things are completely quiet and we can hear what everyone's saying perfectly. Especially if you're in public or in a school, there's always something going on. And if the child has ADHD on top, anything visual is going to catch their eye and they're going to be maybe a little inattentive to the auditory message. The treatment has to be frequent and very intensive. So it might not be 2 times a week for 30 minutes. It might be more than that. And typically the audiologist who does the diagnosing can give lots of good recommendations for the speech pathologist in order to make a plan for the child in the schools. We do have computer software supplements that support traditional interventions too, that they can use. So let's talk about emotional and social effects of ADHD and auditory processing disorders. Paucity of research is a problem in APD, and paucity means there's not a lot of it. So we have a lot to learn about it in order to know what those social emotional effects are. But I think that they probably have the similar problems as individuals with language disorders and with ADHD, I would think as well. So ADHD, since they have so many comorbid disorders like the conduct, oppositional, mood disorders, dysregulation, anxiety, and depression, it socially affects them. You know, parents might not want their kids playing with that boy who's always in trouble, right? A lot of times they're suspended from school. If the school doesn't adequately understand that they have it and don't have a diagnosis, sometimes they don't have a choice. But if those children do have trouble with their learning and social ability due to the ADHD, it is actually an area that can be identified in an IEP under other health impairment in Tennessee. And other health impairment includes lots of different things that are not specific, like a cognitive or an intellectual disorder or a language disorder, speech disorder, hearing disorder, a learning disorder. It's a list of things that are not specified in all of the other major areas of disorders. They may have trouble with police and a decreased quality of life. You know, family life is hard for people with ADHD. It takes, they have to find the right person who has the patience to be in that type of relationship with someone with ADHD. They might have trouble keeping jobs. It's hard to have ADHD sometimes, especially if they haven't been given lots of strategies in order to do life successfully with it. That's it. Take a deep breath. I'm so glad that you're here in my class, and I don't want you to forget to take Chapter 9's quiz in momentum. If you have any questions or any things you want to talk to me about regarding this lesson or anything else, please email me at sextond1@roanstate.edu. I'll be happy to get back in touch with you. Until we meet again, bonsoir.